Hello, U.S. history. This is going to be the lecture on World War II, the war part of World War II. We've already talked about the home front, so now we have to actually talk about the war. This is going to be part one because I will have to break it up into two parts. That way the video won't be super, super long. All right. So let's just start out by talking about some of the minorities that served in World War II. Over 300,000 women served in the military, mostly in, of course, non-combat roles. Remember, World War I was the first time that women could serve in the military, but that was pretty small numbers. I think only like 12,000. Many more are going to serve here in World War II. About 1 million African Americans served in the war. Again, the military is segregated at this time, so we have segregated units. And African Americans are, again, still relegated to mostly non combat roles, but there are some exceptions. We also see hundreds of thousands of Asian American, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans as well all serve in the military, really representing the increased diversity that we see in the United States as compared to previous time periods. So here's some propaganda posters advertising women to join the military. Each service, each branch had its own kind of service for women. Right here, you can see the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, right? There was the WACs and WAVES and SPARs. And the idea with trying to recruit women, as you can see here, free a Marine to fight, right? The idea is if women could serve in these support roles, these stateside support roles, then more men could go serve in combat. We have the famed Tuskegee Airmen. Um, they were an all African American flying unit, one of the most decorated of the war. And they really represent, they became the symbol of the contributions of African Americans in the war effort. One other key group is the Navajo Code Talkers. They were a group of Navajo Indians who worked to create like a secret code language for radio communications. And they mostly worked with the Marine Corps in the Pacific theater of the war. And they were hugely, hugely beneficial because the Japanese were never able to break their code. So another important contribution there. So we'll start off by talking about the war in the Pacific. As you know, the attack on Pearl Harbor, December of 1941, is what brought the United States into the war. It was hugely, hugely damaging to the US, right? Particularly damaging to our war readiness, our capabilities. Our Navy was badly damaged. Thousands of people died. So the Japanese were really able to take advantage of that. And you can kind of see here, they just did this huge land grab basically in the months after the Pearl Harbor attack. They had already been going into Korea, Manchuria, China, and then they went into Burma, Siam, Indochina, Malaysia, the Philippines, and took all this new territory in the months after Pearl Harbor. So the war in the Pacific started off pretty bad for us. The Japanese quickly took a bunch of land while we kind of were recovering from the Pearl Harbor attack. All right. One huge blow, maybe even, on par with, or perhaps even worse by some opinions, was the surrender of the Philippines. In April of 1942, the Japanese attacked and forced the Americans in the Philippines to surrender. If you remember, the Philippines has long been a U.S. base, trade base, military base. We've had it going back to the Spanish American War in 1898. And the Japanese forced us to surrender that base there in the Pacific, and it was hugely, hugely damaging. In the process, they took about 75,000 POWs or prisoners of war, where they took them and they marched them to these POW camps a bit north of where they were captured. And this became known as the Bataan Death March because thousands died on this Bataan Death March. You can see some of the headlines here. Just morally, this was a huge loss, and then also militarily a huge loss as well, because now we're without that kind of key base of operations in the Pacific. Here's a map showing, so this is where the POWs were taken, here on the Bataan Peninsula, and they're forced to march up here to the POW camps. Like I said, thousands, perhaps up to 10,000 died on this Bataan Death March from starvation, disease, abuse, torture, execution, you name it. It was just hugely, hugely brutal and damaging to the Americans. However, by about mid-1942, the U.S. was able to stop the Japanese advance. The key part of that is going to be the Battle of Midway, which took place right near Midway Island. And that was a huge victory for the U.S. and what we really consider the turning point in the war, because that's when we were able to stop the Japanese from taking any more territory, from expanding further in the Pacific, and then we can turn them back. And we're going to launch this, what we call the island hopping campaign. It's sometimes also called leapfrogging, and it's basically our strategy in the Pacific theater. We're going to invade and capture key Pacific islands, and the idea was to cut off the Japanese supply lines and then eventually get close enough to attack mainland Japan. Here's a little graphic here on the Battle of Midway. It's a really interesting battle. I actually think they're coming out with a movie called Midway in a couple months or so about this. It took place just from aircraft carriers. So the Japanese Navy and the American Navy never actually saw each other. It was all done from planes. So it was definitely a big victory. Admiral Nimitz here was the, sorry, trying to get a hold of him. Admiral Nimitz right here was the kind of key victor. He engineered the strategy here in the victory in the Battle of Midway. And when you do, important things like that, win important battles, you get big ships named after you. This is the USS Nimitz. It used to be stationed here in San Diego. That's where this picture is from. But now I believe it's up in Washington State. And hopefully you guys have all been to the USS Midway. So this aircraft carrier was not actually at that battle. It wasn't even built yet. It was actually named for the Battle of Midway. All right. So again, the Battle of Midway, that was the key victory right here in the Pacific Theater. It's the turning point. Now we can start taking territory back, right? So we start this whole island hopping campaign. A couple other key victories, Coral Sea here, that prevented the invasion of Australia, which would have been really bad. And the first kind of key victory we have in this island hopping campaign is the Battle of Guadalcanal, August of 42 through February of 43. That was the first time Americans took back land from the Japanese. And so it's going to be a long, slow process of going to all these little islands like Tarawa and Peleliu and whatnot. We did all these amphibious landings. Mostly the Marine Corps is doing a lot of these amphibious landings. That's kind of what they're known for. But obviously the Army and the Navy is there too. We have some pretty fierce fighting, really terrible conditions. This is tropical setting. It's hot, it's humid, there's bugs, it rains all the time. Just some pretty fierce fighting here in the Pacific Theater. You can see this photograph here is from Life magazine from September of 1943. This is the first photograph of dead soldiers that the War Department allowed to be published in this way, and it just really shows how brutal this war really was and the high cost of it. All right, so switching gears a little bit, let's talk about the European theater. Things were also not too good when we joined the war in late 41, early 42. As you can see, the Germans and the Italians had overtaken much of this land here, as you can see. All right. Obviously we had to focus on what was going on in the Pacific, but really, you know, our first goal had always been to defeat the Axis powers, defeat Hitler in Europe first. And so our first action in the European theater is not actually in Europe, but in North Africa. So we're going to go and join the British to defeat the Italian and German forces in North Africa. Then we're going to turn our attention northward. The idea was to get through Germany through Italy. So if you can see, the idea is to, you know, go through Italy up through Germany here, although this strategy is not super effective. We do invade Italy in July of 1943. We do force them to surrender, which is great. Italy is then going to flip-flop and join the Allies, similar to World War I. However, German forces are going to remain here in like the northern part of Italy for a long period of time. It took a while for us to capture Rome, and then even pretty much until the end of the war, April 45, there are German forces here. So we have to switch gears a little bit and figure out how to get into Germany, right? We can't go this way. So the idea is let's turn our attention and maybe come from the west. Remember, France is occupied by Germany at this point. And that's when we come to D-Day, right? In November of 1943, the big three, Stalin, Churchill, and FDR. This is Baby Bennett here saying hello. They met at Tehran, and this is when they're going to agree to a combined Allied invasion. Stalin had wanted this all along, but Churchill was unsure of this. Finally, after the lack of success in the Italian campaign, then we're going to decide on this invasion of France. This is known as Operation Overlord. This is the air and amphibious invasion of German occupied France. And instead of the British being in charge of this operation, as they had been in North Africa and Italy, the U.S. is going to be in charge of this here. General Dwight D. Eisenhower is going to be in charge, future president. And so it's going to be, like I said, an air and amphibious invasion, right? And this is going to start on June 6th, 1944, otherwise known as D-Day. Sea and air forces are going to start from the southern coast of England and then invade the northern coast of France, which is the Normandy region. You can see the map right here. You can see the British, American, and Canadian forces are going to start here and then invade the beaches here of northern France, which again is the Normandy region. About 150,000 troops landed on the beach and 23,000 more parachuted in behind the German lines over here. And a key part of the D-Day invasion was a little bit of trickery. The Germans knew we were going to invade, but they thought it was going to be here. They thought we were going to come over here from Dover and then invade here at Calais, because as you can see, that's the shortest distance, right? So we actually fooled them a bit, as you can see here from this. You can see here from this photograph, this is an inflatable tank. It's basically a balloon, and we created hundreds of these to basically confuse the Germans as to where we were going to invade from. And so instead of here at Calais, we invaded here at Normandy. All right, and you can see some of the photographs here, all right, of just the massive, massive scale of this invasion. All right, we're going to go ahead and stop there, and I will pick up in part 2.